Welcome back to Your Story Medicine. I am with Susanna Barkataki today, who is a yoga unity activist and the author of Embrace Yoga's Roots, Courageous Ways to Deepen Your Yoga Practice. She supports practitioners to lead with equity, diversity, and yogic values while growing thriving practices and businesses with confidence. She's also the founder of Ignite Yoga and Wellness Institute and runs a yoga teacher training programs for students all around the world. And I was actually one of her earlier students before she took her medicine online. So, Susanna, thank you for certifying me when I was a little baby yogi and I hated yoga. But I'm like, look, as long as I can find a space with people of color, uh, and I don't have to learn a lot of these like big Sanskrit words, and I could just like at least master Shavasana, then maybe I'm going somewhere with this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's just been so amazing to see how far you've come, how far we have both come. How many years ago was that now?
Gosh, I feel like that was maybe what, 2013, 14?
Yes,
A
around
long
that
time,
time.
like the
Um,
7-year window.
Yeah, and a little more background with that time of my life. I was working at the rape crisis hotline center at the domestic violence shelter and as a community organizer. And the reason why I attended Susanna's training was because it was the only one I saw that was centered on bodies of color as well as survivors of sexual trauma. I didn't know anybody else who was doing that. And while my intention for taking your training was to bring that back to the clients I had been working with, the big realization was that I had never had a space to actually heal for
Mm.
myself and my own sexual trauma. So thank you so much for creating that. And now it's become a movement. Now it's like, if you're not trauma informed in the ways that you teach yoga, then get with it. And on top of that, if you're not teaching yoga, or at least if you're not embodying the yogic philosophies that are in line with social justice, then are you actually practicing yoga? And
Yes.
you are spearheading that. It's like, whoa, I know her. She was my teacher before it was cool and trendy.
So true, June, and I remember even before that, like I knew you through creativity and art and spoken word. And so I just want to, like, for folks who are newer to knowing you or me, we're not new to this party, right? Which doesn't mean we necessarily know a whole ton more, but there is some experience and some depth that goes into that. And so thank you for reminding me of that. And like that work, that was just the heart work that I needed to do.
Yeah.
And your cohort reflected back to me, like, there is a need for this, because up until then, no one cared about the kind of yoga that was trauma informed or culturally connected or supporting BIPOC centered voices. And all of a sudden we were like this magical group. And then look at where so many of us have gone, including you.
Right. Because I was a broke activist, broke artist, and I was a scholarship student. And even my relationship to my own value, my own worthiness was just all messed up. And we can dig deeper into this as well, because I know at that time we were both figuring out how is it that we can actually do this work in a way that feels equitable while still thriving in a capitalistic society.
Yeah.
So, actually, I wanted to take this moment to ask you, what is it that you are celebrating about yourself?
Well, you've reminded me of a lot, but the thing that's coming up right now is, so I run yoga teacher trainings that are, BIPOC focused and centered and honoring the roots of yoga and teaching people how to bring that alive. But yoga teacher trainings are expensive. They're like the cost of a college semester at a state school or something. They're a couple $1,000s. And so it's not always accessible to everyone. And so this particular cohort I'm in the middle of running right now, 30% of our student body is on some form of scholarship. And so what that means is access to these teachings for trans folks, for queer folks, for bodies of color and culture. And I'm also really proud because when you have not just one, not just two, scholarship students in a space, what happens is the culture of the community shifts, because the folks who don't normally have access bring so much wisdom and so much collective perspective to the entire program. And so I'm celebrating that, the kind of win of what it means to succeed. Like, we're winning, now there's so many more trauma-informed yoga spaces, so many more workshops on the 8 limbs of yoga or yoga philosophy, not just like get your booty right with yoga, and so we're winning in all these ways. And I feel good about the part that I'm having in that win.
So amazing. I just need to ask, how is it that you were able to get so many scholarships for your students?
Yeah, so I price the training in such a way that the folks who are full pay can counterbalance and like pay towards the folks who are on either partial or almost full scholarship. I don't do many 100% scholarships, because what I've found, and this is a whole other thing we can talk about, but when folks, are paying even $50 a month towards something, they're more likely to show up to it.
Yeah.
And so, but I do a few 100% scholarships. So because of so many people wanting to learn like the true heart and depth of yoga, I was able to leverage that, right? So it's not, again, it's like strategic working with capitalism to be like, all right, there's this lack of access, there's this inflow of desire, let's play with this and see what we can create. So it's always a work in progress. But the next enrollment session we're about to open up for, we're working to even improve that model and be even more transparent and more clear with folks.
Look, when I was a guest teacher in your yoga teacher program, I was so amazed by how many people were invested in their healing, in their growth. Because I remember when you were my teacher, there was like 6 of us at the most. And we were renting this little studio in Hollywood. We didn't even have a yoga studio. Sometimes we would do it at your house.
Yeah.
And now people can access this medicine from the comfort of their homes. So it's wild how now we're in a time where we can create more of that accessibility. And speaking of medicine, if we can strip away your title as a yoga teacher, or all your titles, how is it that you would describe it and what it is you do?
My medicine is really like moving from separation, which is something I lived in and with so much in my life, into wholeness through the tools of yoga. I think that's exactly it. It's like how to come back into wholeness and holding with a deep personal, and like a practice of personal liberation that's connected to social liberation and to others. So that's my medicine, and to have fun and to dance and to be playful and to bring in like deep, heavy, or like intense social justice concepts, but do it in a really fun and empowering way.
What? It can be fun. It doesn't have to be serious.
Totally fun. No,
It can be pleasurable. This
yeah.
is new.
Yeah.
So I know that a reason why so many bodies of color are resistant towards yoga is because I know, at least for myself, when I went to my first studios, I was oftentimes the only melanated person.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to body size, there's a certain there's a certain look of a yogi that is skinny, cisgender, white, and all the stereotypes. Therefore, it's like, why even go when there isn't a place for me? It's interesting. Sometimes I still go to studios where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm the only BIPOC. Well, I'm the only person of color. However, thanks to the practices, I'm not as triggered. I'm like, okay, I'm just here to receive the medicine. But you were this light of hope when I was first introduced to you, because I'm like, what? It's an actual South Asian person teaching yoga. So tell us more about your ancestral lineage and how this has influenced your medicine today and how you choose to show up as a yoga teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I was thinking about that, like the medicine of the family practices, the things that my aunties and uncles would share when I was, say, feeling stressed out about a test at work, how they would share a mindfulness practice or a yoga mantra or a meditation, the things that my dad would say to me if I was having trouble falling asleep. These were all part of the backdrop of my life, as well as the values, like how to live, how to be in the world. That was how I grew up. And so I really grew up as someone, my family, my father's from Assam, which is in the northeast part of India, and kind of almost like a regional minority area, even of India. So it's not a very well-known part of India. And then my mother is from England. And so I'm mixed. And all of that really contributed to, I felt like I relied on these practices because I did not feel like I belonged. I didn't feel like I belonged in England, where I was born. I didn't feel like I belonged in the US, where we emigrated to escape racial violence in England. And I did feel, though, like I belonged with my family. And my extended family is the Assamese and Bengali Indian family that I grew up with in LA. And looking back, well, part of why I belonged, I felt that belonging, was they were emanating yogic ethics. They were emanating yogic practices and sharing it with me. So all of that kind of was watering the seeds of my life. One sec. Yeah. And watering how I was going to be able to bring a practice that I needed to make myself more whole. Instead of feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, I started to feel like I belonged everywhere. And I realized after having some moments of that, like ahas, meditating out under a tree in a field, or being with my family and feeling so connected and welcome, that there was something really powerful in this practice that wasn't just working for me, but it could work for so many others. And then I was like, let's study yoga. And I looked around me and I saw no one who looked like me or like my family members, and no yoga that looked like what they were teaching me anywhere to be found. And so it was this like, oh, there's this gap, there's this huge loss between what yoga truly is and what it's sold to us as in the LA yoga studio scene, which I was in at the time. So I got rid of a bunch of stuff and then moved to India for a couple of years and began a deeper training.
You did your own eat, pray, love? No, it's different.
Yeah, it's really different. And I would say it's really different because I had to buy a one-way ticket because I wasn't going as a visitor or a tourist. Yeah. I was like, I'm going to stay with my family, to live in some schools and work and not like bounce if things get hard. Right? This isn't a tourist trip. This is like a homecoming trip. And so I managed to do that. And then from those learnings and those experiences, come back. And when I tried to teach, and some folks listening might experience this, it was like no one wanted what I had to offer. They just wanted to know like how to get a workout with yoga or whatever, and I didn't look like, I'm not that flexible. I'm short, I'm brown, right? Like you were saying, I didn't fit the image or look of what a yoga person looked like. And so I had to constantly overcome that internalized oppression. And it was actually folks like you who, and others, you know, in that cohort and a few other cohorts, who were like, yeah, we want this. Like this, what you have to share is actually valuable. And we don't want that other stuff. And so it was like this mutual reflection of there's so much more. And we all know that we have something to share here. So I'm really grateful for that. And then now we're like a whole movement, you know, of people who are like, I have so much to offer, but I don't look like the typical yoga person.
I definitely feel like that has shifted in the past couple of years. It's so amazing. I'm like, almost all of my friends are quote unquote certified yoga
Yeah.
teachers at this point. And that's a whole another depth of conversation is, do we even need to be certified in order to teach this? And then also, do we get to call ourselves yogis or a yoga teacher when we are certified if we are not actively embodying these philosophies?
Yeah, I love that question, June. I really strongly believe people need to embody the roots of the practice. And there's so many ways to teach. We can teach in our nonprofit jobs. We can teach in our corporate jobs. We can teach as entrepreneurs. We can be teaching yoga in so many ways. And I'm really in a lot of reflection right now about what am I doing as I run a yoga teacher training? Like, is my intention to pump out people to then go work in studios where we need to burn that structure to the ground? Like, those don't work, you know? They didn't solve, like studios didn't solve the problems of inequity or help us when we were dealing with grief and suffering during, you know, this pandemic that we're perhaps still going through. So there's space for a new model, and I think it's going to be kind of ground up that folks build, and I'm not really sure what it looks like, but I know that structure doesn't work.
Yeah, I also feel like I see, I mean, you are definitely helping to shift the industry. That's for sure. And my question is, where are the boundaries when it comes to appropriating this practice versus appreciating it? And the thing that many BIPOC folks struggle with is, what if I appropriate my own culture? So I'm curious how even your community has been receiving the ways that you've been teaching, the ways you've been showing up, because we've seen the documentaries of yogis who have come from India to the Western world and then gained this massive following that tends to be middle upper class white folks, which then allows them the economic privilege to be able to do what they do. And here you are setting an intention to be more equitable and inclusive, yet it's kind of throwing things off. So let's explore that.
Yeah. First of all, with cultural appropriation, which really at its base is stealing, right? Cultural appropriation is not complicated. It's going into someone else's house, taking their thing, biting their style, taking their art, whatever, and then using it as your own without crediting. And so it's a simple concept that I think even a 5-year-old or someone in kindergarten can understand. And behind it is privilege and power, right? So someone coming from dominant culture who has privilege and power does that theft with that, and then essentially erases the folks that they're taking stuff from. That's happening time and time again all over the world in many different cultures, and it's certainly happening in yoga. And also, there's no one authority, including myself, right, that should be able to tell people this is appropriation and this isn't. Do this or don't do this. Like, No one should put that kind of authority on another person. I feel like my role is that of an educator, and my goal is to really push people to think critically and to kind of do the learning and the research. And I have a lot of resources for folks who are wanting to do that, free and paid, right? Like meeting folks wherever they are, to think critically and determine for yourself, is this appropriation? Is this not? Because if we're relying on someone outside of us, it's not as useful as if we can determine it for ourselves. So that's the first thing around cultural appropriation. Fundamentally, though, with yoga, I always say, look back into the heart of the practice. If appropriation is power, imbalance, and harm to the source culture, then flip those, which you can find that in yoga, power sharing, like Shakti, and appropriate use of Shakti, and non-harm, which is ahimsa. And these are two fundamental principles in yoga. And so we're looking to truly practice yoga as we're engaging with it in a more respectful and more honoring way. So let me be like really concrete about what that might look like. If I'm going to teach a workshop on, say I'm not me, right? So I'm not Indian, I'm an Asian person who's not of Indian descent, let's just say, and I'm going to teach a workshop on mantra. And so mantra is a really important part of my personal practice, but I didn't grow up with it, and it's something that I want to share. I would say, is there a power imbalance? Well, maybe, right? But there's also kind of like Asian folks deal with a lot of the similar or related kinds of oppressions that Indian folks deal with. Is there harm? Well, as long as I, as a teacher, take the time to really understand what mantra is, and don't teach a workshop on affirmations and call it mantra, right? Because they're two different things. Saying like, I am powerful and joyful, that's not mantra. That is an affirmation. Mantra is a phrase or a shloka or a short phrase in Sanskrit. And mantra has very specific power, vibrational power and impact. And so as long as I know what I'm doing and I'm clear on my intentions, I personally would say that is not cultural appropriation, right? But if I'm like, I'm just going to capitalize on this thing, I barely know what it is, and I'm going to sell this workshop and, blend in like cacao and other sacred medicines and call it mantra, but not actually use true mantra, that would be appropriating. So to the other folks of color who are like, am I appropriating my own culture? I really would say first, like, that's a really important question to ask. And then two, where have I internalized like colonial mindset? Because colonial mindset intentionally puts down our own cultures and breaks culture, lineage, tradition. So for example, in my family, being a yoga, and in many Indian families, being a yoga practitioner is actually seen as low class, or like it's distasteful, because the British needed to put down yoga practitioners to be able to control the population, because a populace that feels its own freedom can never be controlled, right? So at the end of the day, I'm sure there are things that I do. In fact, I know there are, because I get this feedback all the time, that some other Indian folks or Desis, Indians in diaspora, don't agree with. And there are many who write to me and are like, thank you for helping me reclaim my path, reclaim my practice. And I have to be okay with myself, with my ancestors, with my teachers. I have a community of teachers in India as well as here. And so it's not like I get to just create my own accountability. The accountability happens in community. So I'd invite folks into that, right? Like, one, ask the question, but then two, like, unpack if there's insecurity or internalized depression that you're needing to overcome, and then build your community.
One of the challengings that I am learning to accept and celebrate is that sometimes my teachers are going to come in white bodies, and that they have done the work, or they're actively doing the work. I'm going to give an example. So I was actually at a tattoo shop last week, my friend's tattoo shop. He does traditional Filipino tattoos. And I was like, yeah, I'm good. I'm going to get my first tattoo. And I was actually going to get the green Tara mantra. But when I went there, thankfully, this is a homie. Had I gone to any other any other tattoo shop, they would have been like, okay, that'll be $60 or something. And they asked the question, why? How come you're not getting something of your own roots? And I was like, well, because like all these, I feel like these white folks who go to Thailand and get these Angelina Jolie tattoos by these monks have kind of ruined it. And I don't want to be associated with them. And they're like, oh, so you're going to go and do the same thing as these white folks to this Tibetan culture. I was like, damn. And so they were lovingly telling me, like, this is your opportunity to reclaim.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And the tattoo artist they actually recommended to me is in Thailand, but he's a white man who apparently has been living in Thailand majority of his life. His wife is Thai. And I was like, I don't want to. And I did some research. I'm like, okay, I think this is somebody who has intentionally immersed himself in the culture. So the reason why I'm sharing this story is because I know that a lot of times we may have that resistance of not wanting to, like, we want to find somebody that looks like us, which I think is a major bonus. And I know a lot of my own South Asian friends who are yoga teachers that were actually certified by other white folks.
Yeah.
And they've had to grapple with that guilt too of, am I deserving of calling myself like South Asian enough if I had to learn about my ancestors' medicine from somebody else who had access to go back to my roots?
Right, because we don't all have that access for so many layers. There's just so much in it. That's so powerful. I'm really glad that your friend and that tattoo shop is asking that question. I wish all tattoo artists got cultural appropriation training, at least to ask these questions. Yeah, that's so deep. So absolutely, white folks or anyone can, I believe, can teach and practice the full expanse of what yoga is. It's not about blood quantum or where we're from. Yoga doesn't actually care if we're teaching in a high-end resort or in a tiny little hut at the foothills of the Himalayas or like in a garage somewhere in the San Fernando Valley. You know, it doesn't matter. The depth of the practice is available in any of those places in any form. And so that does make it a little tricky when someone's looking for a true teacher, right? Or a great teacher or a really authentic teacher, to know, how do I find that? And I would say there's a couple of things to look for. And one is like, are they putting themselves up by putting other people, specific people, right? Or groups of people down? For me, that's a red flag. Is it more cultish or kind of like going towards, this is the only way to teach, I have the one right method, no one else does? Those are also red flags, because in the tradition, in the yoga tradition, it's a very, what's the word, kind of like universalist. It's actually very accepting. There's a renunciate path, meaning like becoming a monk or a nun or a sannyasi, removing attachments to the world. There's a householder path, which I'm clearly on. I have a kiddo, I have a dog, I have a, home. It's like, and there always have been these different paths. There's the bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, of love, karma yoga, the yoga of action, social justice, engagement in the world, jnana yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge and understanding, and raja yoga, which is like asana, hatha yoga, physical practice. And one can go down any of those four paths or multiple of those four paths with a teacher that has taken any form, right? Because also in the yogic understanding, we've had many different incarnations, in our lives. And so what we show up as is really just a vehicle for sharing the truth, and so it doesn't really matter. So I just try to be discerning and then like check out where people kind of come from and what their credentials are. And then also, like, do they have cult vibes, and stay away if they do, including like Western yoga studio spaces, which often come off more like MLMs, multi-level marketing.
Yeah. Well, who's the yoga teacher that got hella blasted for all these sexual assault accounts? Bikram, right? So the new yoga studio I'm going to, very inclusive, and yet we still do the Bikram yoga sequence. And so it's also that practice of like loving the teachings and separating it from the teacher.
That's so huge. Yeah.
So huge. And who gets to be the gatekeeper just because this person is South Asian or is of the lineage? Does that mean that we have to get consent or permission from them to be able to do these practices? And I know one of the things that you talk a lot about is whether or not it's appropriate to use Namaste.
Yeah.
I will say most of the studios I'm in now don't use it, but it's still something that's prevalent. So like well, first of all, I guess this poses the question of like, I feel like a lot of people may see you as this gatekeeper. Maybe they're slipping into your DMs like, Susanna, is this okay? So how do you navigate that? And who's allowed to use these mantras?
Yeah. People do sometimes ask me those questions, and I always try to say what I said to you, which is like, ultimately, I can give you my thoughts. I can give you some points of inquiry, but you have to decide for yourself. I also prefer not to coach through DM. So
sign up for her programs.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk about at the end of this.
Right. Here's some free resources. Here's, a paid offering if you want to like join the office hours and ask all the questions. You're hearing my puppy, who's obviously excited about this too. But so with Namaste, it's traditionally, it's not that there's, and I know folks are like, why won't you give us a simple answer, Susanna? It's because none of this is cut and dried, right? Like Namaste, in where I come from, it's a greeting. We join our palms together, and two elders or two people we respect will say, and we'll often bow, and we'll say Namaste or Namaskar. It literally translates to bow to you. There's no I even in Namaste. And it's a greeting of reverence and respect. It was so strange when I first started hearing it at the end of yoga classes. It was like, why are we saying, it doesn't exactly mean hello, but like, why are we saying this greeting at the end? I don't understand. And so I started to just look more at, well, what is this teacher doing? Because it's often white Western teachers, and they're basically like telling us we're done. But it also comes off like a benediction or like a blessing, or like they're giving us some kind of spiritual, like we're done now and I've transmitted my wisdom to you and off you go, and I thought, this is weird. It's like, it's Orientalization, it's like they're taking this word to signify their own spiritual power, essentially. And then we're all saying it back like, oh, but it comes across when we say it back like, oh, thank you. Like, it's just, it became this strange caricature of what Namaste actually had functioned as in the culture. And so I wrote some articles about it and said, hey, why are we doing this? What does it mean? And I still would say, I'm not telling people not to say it. I'm actually just asking you to think about, what is the context? Why are you saying it? what do you mean? You know, because when I first was teaching yoga, I would say it too, because it's what many of my colleagues and classmates around me were saying. And if I stopped saying it, I remember my class looking at me, I'd be like, thank you. And they're like, okay, what's next? We're not done, you know, and what do we do now? And so everyone expected it as the end. And so I had to get creative. And I often like to say the alternative to cultural appropriation is creativity. So creatively, how could I get that same like ending that was like the aha, the internalization of some kind of spiritual wisdom or some kind of peace or some kind of just like brilliant, wonderful, joyful end, not by utilizing a word that doesn't actually fit that moment. And so I had to explore different things like poetry or quotes or, you know, just saying what was on my heart in the moment. And so I made up this whole list of like almost 100 different alternative endings to a yoga class. And I just kind of pull through and rotate them. So I tend to not say it. Also, in particular, because I'm listening to other folks like myself, other South Asians who are like, it makes me feel weird. It makes me feel orientalized and like awkward. And not everyone feels that way, right? But when enough people from within the culture are like, oh, it's a little cringy, then it's like, why do I need to say it, right? That's the invitation to folks to consider. Is there some other way you can convey the same thing? And I'd invite other folks of color, culture, right? We all come from some kind of culture. Like, can you look into what are the traditional greetings or endings or rituals from your practices and your path? And could you do that?
I love that. The opposite of cultural appropriation, beyond appreciation, is creativity.
Yeah.
So with a lot of the challenges and the injustices that we are seeing today, how is it that like there's a lot of people who can feel like they're walking on eggshells when they want to do better. I want to be a better ally, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I just want to be a good person. And yet ally has become such a catchphrase. So how is it that we can move beyond being just an ally into somebody that is an active participant whenever we are in situations where somebody feels like they can't speak up without playing the role of a savior?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot as a non-Black person of color, and also as someone with a lot of light skin privilege because I'm mixed. So to my other like brown siblings who are darker skinned than myself, for example, it's really not as an ally, right? Or like as an ally working on anti-Blackness, for example, or colorism, it's actually my place to listen to others and foreground them, lift them up rather than center myself. For another example would be like as a trans ally, I'm a cis woman. And so even though I have lots of thoughts and lots of opinions and have really worked to understand how to make my classes more trans inclusive, for example, I would not solo teach a workshop on trans inclusivity in yoga. It's not my place, right? It's my place to be like, here's this trans yoga teacher, here's that trans yoga teacher, learn from them. So I think really beyond allyship, it's like accomplishship, like how can I, or even like, I don't know, like colleagueship, like how can I put myself next to you, but even a little bit like it doesn't have to be a hierarchy, but kind of like at your feet in terms of learning from you and centering your knowledge and wisdom and lived experience. It doesn't even have to be that dramatic, but just like, how can I lift folks up who are centered or targeted at the locus of harm, right? Which is why with yoga, I often am willing to center myself as a South Asian person living in this world in this particular form, and other South Asian folks. Whereas when we're talking about racial justice, it would need to be Black folks who are centered, not other folks of color and culture, right? So it's looking at like who's closest to the center of marginalization, or like on the periphery, away from the center of power, who's the most underestimated, and then using our privilege to not like go in and try to tell folks what to do or take over, but to listen and lift up. And honestly, I make mistakes all the time, all the time. The other day I took a quote, it was like a little while ago, and I didn't realize it was a quote from a Black woman. And I wrote the quote graphic, like, and put my name, under it. And someone called me out. It's like, I'm not saying we cancel Susanna Barkataki, but maybe we cancel Susanna Barkataki because she just ripped off a Black woman. It's like, oh my gosh, right? And so my immediate is like, one, I didn't mean to. Two, that was totally not my intention. I feel terrible. But like, three, I still did the harm, And so I sat with it. It was an interesting moment because the person who called me out was a white person. And so he's like, this is fascinating. But just to be concrete about, I left the quote up. I changed because people had commented, not just that person, but other folks of color had commented on the thread to be like, what are you doing? Ripping off, it was Maya Angelou's quote, and putting your name. I was like, so I changed the caption and said, update, here's the correct quote. I did not know, doesn't matter though, still caused harm. So I'm donating to the Maya Angelou Institute in an attempt to do some reparations for the harm caused here. And it was the like, now that we know better, we'll do better. That quote that she has, I actually should look up the exact words, but, and I felt I had to sit with the discomfort of like, I really messed up. And all I can do is not hide it, not try to brush it away, but to learn and, to check things when I make memes, for example, or post something. And then to understand that we will mess up, like folks will mess up. I'm sure you've experienced that, and
so much.
Yeah.
Look, you can listen to one of my older podcast episodes about being canceled, Odyssey of the Martyr, and just how these experiences tend to be the greatest opportunities for growth. And I personally, I strongly resonate with co-conspirator, because to conspire means to breathe. So how is it that we can learn how to breathe alongside one another? And also, instead of being in a place where furthering shaming people for our mistakes, and there's healthy shame too, by the way, because sometimes that's the very thing that wakes us up to be able to do better next time. How is that we can still strive for this collective vision of what liberation can look like and what it can feel like for all of us? So Susanna, how is it that yoga can actually be that tool for us to come together without spiritually bypassing all the work that it's going to take to get to this shared goal? Whether or not, we don't even know if we all share it, but I'd like to think that we are dreaming of a world that is more equitable and kind. And side note, Susanna was the very first person who ever introduced me to the term spiritual bypassing, which now a lot more people are familiar with. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so prevalent, spiritual bypassing, which is like using spiritual truth, like say we're all one, or yoga is unity, to bypass the actual lived conditions of separation or inequity or inequality that we're living in, right? So I often say to people, when I have time and patience, like, yeah, I share that ideal. I too want to see us as all one. And I know that your baby, your kids, like none of us see color, but that's one, not actually the reality of our lived experience. Like I personally get stopped at when I cross borders, you know, because of the color of my skin, because of my name, because of being an immigrant. If I'm talking to a white person, and you might not, you know, and I have friends and colleagues who get stopped by the police, you know, or family members who get stopped by the police just because of what they look like. These are real lived experiences. So yes, I share that ideal, but we are not there. And the way to get there isn't to deny it. The way to get to that ideal is to address what's truly happening. And so yoga has the particular practices of svadhyaya. Sva means self and dhyaya study. So self-study, so self-inquiry, and clear seeing. So like vichara and viveka, which are like clear seeing and analysis and discriminative thinking. Like by discriminative, not meaning discriminate, but like understand what is happening in the world and remove illusions. Maya, these are yogic terms, but I think we can all understand them, like remove the illusion that gets in the way of getting to truth. And the more we can get to that truth of what is, the more we get, the closer we get to the truth of interbeing, all love, connection, unity. Because I think this is why I love yoga, is at its heart, all of us are seen as perfect and whole and beautiful already. And it's the illusions that we're clearing off. And it's the same collectively, right? Like we're headed in this direction of wholeness, of unity, but we need to clear away the illusions. And that may take us another 100 years. I don't know if we'll get there in our lifetimes, June, but you know, and folks listening, we might, if we have like a quantum leap in consciousness, which I know some of you are bringing in your various ways, but we will get there. The yogic philosophies are very optimistic philosophies, ultimately. I did want to say, I wanted to share the actual correct Maya Angelou quote, since I brought it up. Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better, by Maya Angelou.
Wow. And how perfect is that quote for what you experienced?
Yeah, it was, yeah. And just to wrap that story, right, the person who wrote was very harsh with me and was like trying to, you know, really like
She
call
was
me out.
being a good ally.
She was, yeah. And I wrote back, you know, and just like, I hear you, not defensive. I mean, I did want to say like, white woman, go get your people. Like, why are you coming after me? But I knew that wasn't going to help matters, right? And 6 months later, she wrote to me and she's like, thank you for responding with so much grace, because I was early on in my journey and I realized that my, you know, all of that was misplaced and you handled it so well. And I learned so much. It was like, oh, wow, that's cool. And it's not that I did it. I did it honestly to protect my own peace, right? I wasn't in that moment trying to teach her a lesson. Nothing works when I'm trying to teach. It just doesn't work when I'm trying to teach others. But I was doing what made the most sense for me in a moment where I messed up, you know, but I wanted to come out of that mess up feeling as in alignment as possible. And yoga supports me with that. Like when I'm like, what do? I literally go back to the yamas and niyamas, which I taught you, you know, I always am returning back to those as fundamental, like the ground of practice.
It's so key, because I remember when I was doing wellness consulting for different nonprofits and social justice orgs, and that was like me being a part of your program was actually the catalyst to so much of that. I just got fired from my job, but then all these doors started opening for me to start bringing in a different way of being. And yet it still felt like wellness and justice were mutually exclusive. At that time, it was, okay, you can go learn about these wellness practices from June, or you can learn about how to organize your communities. And I just remember asking, why are those things being seen as separate, and reflecting back on my own days when I was just beginning, when I was a baby organizer, when I was learning how to be politicized, that the ways that I was showing up was from that place of fight. It was always about the struggle. It was always anger was a core part of my identity. And because of yoga and coming back to so many of my own ancestral practices, it's given me the opportunity to be able to pause and, before I react, take a breath, reflect, and genuinely see the wholeness of this being, the hurt they are experiencing, as well as my own hurt that I get to tend to, before causing even more harm.
Yeah. That's powerful.
So, with that being said, where is it that people can begin their own journey of embracing yoga's roots and decolonizing their own practice if they already have one?
Yeah. What's beautiful about this time, and I imagine for a lot of folks listening, is you may be already quite far along on that journey, because so many of us now are having these conversations. And if you're not, that's okay. You'll find a lot of people who want to be there with you. And there's different ways in, right? Yoga is one of those paths with thousands of doorways. And so it may be reading yoga philosophy and finding a group to explore and study yoga philosophy with. It might be reading the sutras, like the Yoga Sutras. It might be practicing yogic ethics and having, I think there's so much benefit in having folks that support you in the practice, like reading groups or study groups or practice groups. It might be finding yoga asana teachers, like yoga classes, what we think of as typical yoga classes, taught by bodies of color and culture, looking for BIPOC teachers, looking for South Asian teachers, supporting those teachers, following them, learning with them online, going and seeking them out in person. It makes a huge difference. It makes a huge, huge difference to those teachers and to those communities. I mean, look, right? Like, June, if you hadn't been there, I wouldn't have been where I am now. Like, it really was that affirmation of you. And there were like, 8 other people who were like, yes, we want this. And then that gave me the confidence to continue learning and growing and teaching and eventually writing a book. And, so know that your choices as a participant can have a huge impact. So it's kind of like decolonizing where you're learning from. Try to get books on your shelves that are written by South Asian teachers, and practice with South Asian yoga practitioners. There are many now, and with many of us being online, there's a lot more opportunity. So those are some of the first ways I would suggest, and ways that I do, and really get a lot from doing.
Susanna is so humble. She's like, oh yeah, just go follow other South Asian teachers without even plugging in the incredible work that she's doing. So I know that you just published your book a little less than a year ago, Embrace Yoga's Roots, which I know there's a whole backstory to that too. It went from, because I was there in the beginning, it went from Honors Yoga's Roots to Embrace Yoga's Roots, which honestly for me feels so much more like it just feels less hierarchical. So I love that so much. So definitely, where can people find a copy of your book and your yoga teacher training?
Yeah, thank you, June, for mentioning. Yes, if you like to follow like fun and provocative education around this kind of stuff, you can also follow me on Instagram. I love to share stuff there. And then my book, you can find really anywhere books are sold. You can ask your local bookstore to order it, or on Amazon. And then the website for it is embraceyogasrootsbook.com. also about to put out a bundle with a workbook that's all about like bringing stuff from the book alive and out into your life. So I'm really excited about that. And teacher trainings, for me, they're my favorite thing to do. I love teaching groups of people over a period of time to experience transformation. And so if it's like, this is right for me to go deeper with yoga, even if you've already done a training or, you're not sure if yoga training is right for you, you don't need to be flexible. You don't need to be able to touch your toes. You don't need to look a certain way. You don't need to have been practicing yoga ever to want to go deeper. All you really need is like an open-minded heart. And so there you can look up Embody Yoga's Roots. And we have a foundations training, which is a 200-hour, which is going to be enrolling soon. And then a advanced training, which is like after you've done the foundations training, which is a 300-hour. And so you can explore either pathway. And I love these trainings. And they're also places to like meet like-minded people and form these, really like compassionate yoga revolutionary circles that then go out and make change in different locations in the world. So growing and growing.
Yes. And I would personally say, just from experience as somebody who's gone through the training, don't go in it so much with the intention to teach, but to learn more about these roots for yourself so that you can practice it, embody it in your everyday life, because this is going to be skills that are going to support you in your own liberation, which will then ripple out to the individuals that you interact with, the communities, as well as the society and the systemic change we want to see. So thank you so much, Susanna. I have no idea where my certification is. I'll probably have to go through the 200-hour training again.
You got this, June. You can just write to us and be like, hey, can I get a certificate?
I'll be sure to do that. Did it expire? Because it's like almost 10 years now. Wow.
It did not expire. I actually weirdly remember making your certificate. I don't know why I remember that, but I think it meant, I remember it really meaning so much to me that, that you were getting this certification, that you were taking it back to your communities. And more than that, that it was like something you had said yes to in your life.
Received that. Thank you. Yeah. I will look for it.
But just email me.
I want your actual signature, not the printed version. Okay. It's like, okay, this is signed by the real Susanna Barkataki. So my last question is, if you can envision yourself as a future ancestor who is looking back to either, it could be present day, or it could be the version of Susanna who may have been questioning whether or not this was going to be the right path, this yogic path for her, what is it that you would say?
Trust yourself and trust the ancestors to guide you, and have a lot of fun. Like, don't worry about it. Just keep going and have fun.
I love it. Trust, because wow, our younger selves would be so amazed by what it is we've created and what it is we're creating, and how beautiful is it that there gets to be even more of us on this path. So thank you for giving me permission to receive that support, to know that I'm always being divinely guided, not just by mentors and teachers and friends, but by my ancestors and by my guides and by this future ancestral version of myself that has been cheering me on this whole time.
Yes. Oh, I love that.